Today we're discussing the book Mine, how the hidden rules of ownership control our lives, which is kind of like a Freakonomics for ownership. And there's so many fascinating stories in this book. And I think I have to start with this story that Michael was discussing in the book, where basically a big pharma research chief told you that his team had a promising Alzheimer's drug, but development was blocked, not by rivals, but by biotech partners that each had a very small patent. The cost of licensing all these patents essentially made progress impossible. So there's actually like a patent, or there could be a potential drug for Alzheimer's. And then just how common is this, not just in, say, big pharma, but in kind of all aspects of the economy?
So people don't realize that ownership is like a secret language. It controls every piece of our lives. And the story that you're asking about is one of the more common and also more hidden stories of ownership, that too much ownership, surprisingly, can be as costly as too little. So I call this gridlock, ownership gridlock. And ownership gridlock is actually a surprisingly common phenomenon in our modern economy, that it's pretty easy to create lots of little bits of ownership, lots of patents of small bits of some biotech product, where hundreds or potentially even thousands of separate companies, separate owners, can each own a piece, for example, of one gene. So you're a company that wants to put an Alzheimer's drug in a bottle. You want to make a pill, but to make that pill, you have to license dozens or even hundreds of separately owned pieces of property, separately owned patents. And that licensing turns out to be extremely difficult. It leads to gridlock, where too much ownership leads to too little life-saving drugs in a bottle. Again, people don't complain about the missing drugs because you don't know that they could exist. Like, no one's told you, hey, we can solve this disease, we can cure this problem. Because the drug doesn't come into existence. It's an invisible ownership dilemma that is across our modern economy. The problem of creating ownership at the wrong scale. Too many owners leading to too few of whatever the good is that you're trying to get. It's not just drugs in a bottle. It's also fast, high-speed cell phones. It's also having enough runways to be able to not sit around in an airport all day. So it's all the same problem.
Yeah, you're also talking about, you started that, I believe this was chapter 3, where you started it off talking about Dr. Martin Luther King and how people that were using them, or like you'll see a speech in a movie and it's not even the actual speech because they can't actually license the speech, right? So it's like, you're like, thinking like, this is like this great speech that MLK wrote. And apparently it's like a paraphrase version.
It's so funny. So people, they have a lot of movies now where you have actors with the cadence of Dr. King and with the sort of ambiance of Dr. King, but the actual words, if you listen to them, they aren't his words because they're locked up in a company that won't necessarily license them for use in the movie or TV show, or even just as for a part of a Martin Luther King celebration. You can't use them on the news. The "I Have a Dream" speech, the sort of iconic speech from our childhoods, is owned by a company that is very protective of when and how it gets used. So that's just one example of the Dr. King speech. But for many documentaries and films, and also a lot of music, if you're trying to sample a lot of different pieces of ownership, a sample from this song, a sample from that song, and you want to put them together into something new, that becomes also extremely hard to do. Just like the too many patents leading to too few new drugs, too much ownership in the copyright area, in the music area, in the art and film and documentary area, too much ownership there also leads to copyright gridlock, where you have too little new, innovative, fun, cool music and film and TV shows coming into existence.
And it's interesting, to make this sort of current as possible. There's a lawsuit right now that's working its way through with AI, large language models. What makes them large language models? They're basically scraping all of this stuff that's copyrighted. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But that's kind of the guts of these AI apps.
Yeah, I definitely want to get to AI in a little bit. Yeah, so thanks, Jim, for bringing that up. Kind of like finishing up a little bit of chapter 3, I was pretty fascinated to think that like the ownership of these celebrities lasts well beyond their death. And you, of course, mentioned like Mickey Mouse, how Disney company was able to keep extending the copyright. And there's the same thing like you mentioned with Dr. King, where he died in 1968, and I believe his son was it Dexter, just passed away in 2024. But then was it like their grandkids then get like an extra 20 years or something? Was that basically what you were saying? Like this stuff basically lasts a century, and like you'd have the grandson who controls it, who never even met the guy, which is like fascinating to think about. And then you get into like AI stuff, like as Jim was talking about, like, so then could you like could he, since he owns the likeness of MLK, create new speeches with his likeness and then license that because he of course has like the copyright?
Actually, he can. So there's, people think of ownership as just this natural thing, like it, pre-exists society. It's mine because I'm holding on to it. But it turns out that ownership is a form of modern engineering. Just like when you go to the moon, that's like rocket engineering. It's pretty sophisticated. Ownership engineering is pretty sophisticated as well. And part of that newest form of ownership engineering is actually you might be familiar with it in like NCAA athletes, like the way college athletes now make money is with a new form of property, name, image, and likeness, which is a new kind of ownership that's been created in the commercial value of your personality, the sound of your voice, your look. Any of those things now can be a separately owned piece of property. And that isn't necessarily a problem. We want to have people be able to commercialize and get the value of that they're actually bringing to the table out as an athlete or as Dr. King. The problem comes in when you have too much of that ownership, when it's too overlapping, when it becomes hard to actually assemble bits of that ownership into some new product, into that, for example, into AI. So if you have, if you actually applied the current property laws, ownership laws over ideas, over images, very little of AI could exist. That's all basically being stolen by the AI companies, if you believe that the underlying rights should be in the person who creates the image.
So, Jim, you had a couple fascinating kind of stories in this book. Since we'll kind of switch gears a little bit, but I would say the 3 most fascinating for me was the Duke Blue Devil basketball, how they actually sell the tickets. I thought how New York City gets its drinking water and how they actually avoided spending billions of dollars on a very expensive water treatment plant. Was fascinating. And then, of course, the solar panel versus the Redwood neighbor war, which I thought was awesome. So can you kind of like what you can, pick one or however you want to go at it?
Yeah, let me talk about the Duke one because that's fun. It's how I start off my property class. So I taught at Duke for 11 years. And I, would have students in the law school that also gone undergrad. And I would say, what was the most important, meaningful experience you had, this wonderful university? And without doubt, every single one said, camping out for the basketball game. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Because it's such a bizarre idea. So essentially, Duke, as you know, is a great basketball team. And the tickets, if they sold in the market, would go for hundreds, thousands of dollars. But the students, most of the students, you don't want them paying that. And so Duke has created this system where in order to allocate season tickets for the students, they do something called camp out. And this is like the second or third weekend after classes have begun. And there's this area, sort of grassy area in front of the stadium. It's called Krzyzewskiville, named after the great coach, Coach K. And essentially you have to show up Friday afternoon. And then in these random times, every hour, every 3 hours, whatever, there's a horn. You have to register at a table within like 10 minutes. You have to stay there until Sunday morning, and it's a great party until it's really just not a great party and tedious. Then at that point, if you've lasted that long, you don't get tickets. You get put into a lottery for tickets, and then that's how you get the tickets, and they're free, right? And so, as someone teaching property, I thought to myself, what a bizarre system. What is going on? But if you think about it, through, as Michael was saying, ownership engineering, it's brilliant, because you have to ask yourself, so Duke has a scarce resource. They have these tickets, right? Tickets beside the court. How are they going to allocate them, right? And ownership is all about allocating. Who gets access to the scarce resource? Who doesn't? Who gets what and why? So what could they do? Well, they could simply say, we're going to do it by lottery, which is what they end up doing. They could say, we're going to auction them. They could say, we're going to favor seniors. That's not what they do. And you have to ask, what are they looking for? Who they want on the seats? And the people they want on the seats, it turns out, are a special brand called Cameron Crazies. It's Cameron Indoor Stadium. And these are people who paint their faces blue. They stand and scream for an hour and a half. And the question is, how are you going to select for that? And so essentially they have this brilliant system where only people who are going to camp out for 2 days just for the chance of getting a ticket are going to get that. And so it's a wonderful example of essentially engineering for what you want, right? And Duke doesn't actually care about the money up front. Of course, once you've been through this sort of bonding experience, you're an incredibly loyal alum in the future, and you will give a lot of money, which they do in the future as well. And so, you could think of other things they could have done, right? They could have had a free throw shooting competition. They could have done anything. But it's a nice example of our ownership engineering, because you're basically getting people to do what you want. In order to get access to this is basically what you're gonna have to do. Before I go on, Michael, anything you want to add to that?
Well, it's an example of what Jim and I call the remote control of ownership. That's really the surprising story that most of your listeners might not realize coming in listening to you today, which is that ownership, again, it feels dry. It's like boring. It's what law students and lawyers do. But the reality of it is that savvy companies across the economy think of their ownership as essentially a remote control. They can press the buttons to steer you to do what they want without you even realizing it. So what Duke wanted was absolutely crazed fans in the stands, and they used their ownership over these tickets to steer people to do exactly that. And the way that they figured out how to do it was through this otherwise insane system of having people camp out for days on end. That was a great example of Duke figuring out how to use the remote control to get to their very specific, very unusual goal with their tickets.
For me, the very fascinating one was just the redwood trees and the solar panels in Sunnyvale, which is, of course, California. It was just kind of fitting that this is the name of the city or town, whatever, in Northern California that this took place in.
Yeah, so I love the story, and as you said, it was a perfect setting. So you've got these two neighbors who live in a cul-de-sac, and they're both virtuous greens. They pray at the altar of environmentalism, and so this one couple, they put solar panels on their houses, on their roof, and that's great. They're getting sort of green electrons, avoiding fossil fuels, avoiding climate change emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, next door to them are some neighbors who have some redwoods. And as we all know, redwoods grow. And over time, the redwoods start to shade the solar panels. And so, this being the wonderful country of America, they sue each other, or the solar panel owners sue the redwood owners. And it under something called nuisance. And the question is, was it an unreasonable use of property that substantially injured the property owner? And it could go either way, right? On the one hand, the shade they're casting is in fact harming their neighbors, so they are causing harm to them. They're getting fewer green electrons. On the other hand, they're just growing trees, and the trees were there first. And so, the one of the things that we use this to show in the book is that we tend to think of harm as kind of a one-way a one-way street. In fact, harm's reciprocal, right? You could tell the story that, look, I mean, the solar owners are trying to basically clear cut their neighbor's property. That doesn't seem fair either. And so then it comes down to, again, Michael saying, well, why do we have ownership rules? We have ownership rules because we want to achieve a certain end. And so the state of California basically ends up saying, we're going to put the thumb on the scale of solar energy. And so essentially, the solar panel owners win. There's a caveat if the trees were there first. But essentially, it's this situation where either side has a valid claim. Michael, you can jump in again on this one.
Well, one of the things that we discovered in writing this book, to our surprise, we've been teaching in this area for 30 years, each of us, is that there are just 6 simple stories that everyone uses to claim everything in the world, right? It's mine because I had it first, or it's mine because I worked for it. So the example of the Redwoods and the solar panels is one of those 6 stories. It turns out that's one of the stories that we call attachment. It's mine because it's attached to something mine. So one landowner in Sunnyvale says, wow, the solar panels are attached to my house. Those solar beams are attached to my house. That's mine. And the other landowner there, the neighbor, has just as strong an attachment to the attachment story. The landowner there is saying, these redwoods are attached to my land, and they're growing as part of who I am. I'm a redwood tree grower. So what you have there is a story, an attachment story of mine against mine. And the most powerful conflicts that we face as owners are often mine versus mine stories, where people are using, in that example, the same story, the story of attachment, or often they're using different stories. Like when my child was small, holding on to a little shovel in the playground, saying, mine, it's mine. I had it first. That's one of the 6 stories, first in time. And her brother pulls it away and says, no, I possess it. I'm holding on to it. So it's possession versus first. That's 2 more of those 6 stories. But it turns out there's only 6 of them. Attachment for the redwoods, and then first, and then possession, and just 3 more.
Yeah, I think one thing to sort of add to this, and it sort of is implicit in what you've been saying, Jesse, is there's no right answer, right? Ownership is all about storytelling. And who can tell the more persuasive story?
And it seemed like in this particular story that so they kind of sided with the solar panels, but then at the same time, then there was it made it sound like there was some type of kind of pushback later on, because the actual owners of the other house that had the redwood trees planted those 5 years before. So then it seemed like there was kind of there is more legislation or regulation in California, because then, and you also mentioned the story in Boulder, Colorado, where you had this person bought this property. The neighbor ended up, using it. Find it funny that the guy was a judge, so he probably knew the rules. Obviously, he probably had I imagine him with a calendar, and he's 13 days left before I can confiscate this property legally. But I actually found that story fascinating. And then, of course, the point I'm making, though, is that he actually then gave the land back up because he lost, friends, and there was a lot of pushback. So just because the law is on your side or the rules are on your side of this ownership, you still have shaming and just traditional, people just being humans.
Yeah, Michael, you want to give the adverse possession story?
Well, yeah, 99% of ownership conflicts happen outside of the law. When you drive down the street and look for a parking place and someone else gets there at the same time as you, that's an ownership conflict. When you're lining up at the deli to get a coffee and it's not clear, who's going to get the coffee, who's going to be first, that's an ownership conflict. So all of these stories that you're raising are all stories where it's mine versus mine. It's a storytelling battle. And it's one where most of the time, overwhelmingly, all day long, to get through your day, you face and solve 100 ownership stories outside the law. So the example that you raised about the judge in Colorado, most people may not know, but in America, if you are on somebody else's land for long enough, openly enough, after it might be 7 years, it might be 10, it might be 20, it depends on the state, the land that you are squatting on becomes your land. It's not theft. It's called adverse possession. And it's an ancient doctrine in American law. So people get really mad, though, when you adversely possess their land. So in the story that you raised, the judge had the law on his side. He had adversely possessed it for long enough. He had squatted on it for long enough with his rose garden and his paths in the yard that it was technically, legally his. But that kind of technical legal solution often runs up against what people actually believe to be right. And what people actually believe to be right often ends up carrying the day. So it carried the day in the Colorado adverse possession case, and ultimately carried the day in the California Redwood solar panel debate. So the Redwood owners were criminally convicted for having redwood trees that shaded the solar panels. People got so mad in California at that outcome, even though they love solar panels, that they changed the law. So that those redwood owners were the only people who were ever convicted of criminal redwood tree ownership.
I lived in various Colorado ski towns for 9 years. I'm pretty familiar with, even though Boulder's not a ski town, but I've been to Boulder numerous times. But I mean, Boulder, of course, is like expensive property. I mean, you could be talking like in $20-$25. This judge could have been essentially being able to legally legally possess millions of dollars in land.
Not just Colorado. It's it's wherever you are in America listening. This doctrine exists, and it's if somebody's mowing part of your backyard, or they put the fence a couple feet over into your lawn, after a couple of years, that the fence isn't in the wrong place. After a couple of years, the fence is in the right place. Like the property line actually changes, and that's not like some weird. It's not like a California thing or a Colorado thing. That's in every state, and that's been true for all of American history.
Yeah, the logic behind it's not crazy. I mean, the logic is, look, if you're not paying enough attention to your own property to know that someone's been making use of it continuously, notoriously, openly, you don't deserve to own it.
Going back to, was it 160 acres and whatnot, right?
Yeah, a lot of those ownership battles actually took place back in the era when the settlers were moving west and dispossessing Native American tribes. And the rule for dispossession was if you squatted on the land for long enough, it became yours. So that was a very important principle in Native American land dispossession, or conversely, American settler expansion out west.
I read like 100 and, I don't know, depending on the year and how much time I have, but somewhere between like 120 and 180 books a year. And I kind of get on these kicks.
You read a lot of books.
Read a lot of books. Well, that's what happens when you don't have a job, right? You just got time
this is the job. This is you have the best job ever.
Right. Yeah. So, but I was on this kick where I was reading all these like books from Eastern European authors. And of course, my favorite was The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which is just a great book. But then it turns out that you actually lived in Eastern Europe. After the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, you were working for the World Bank, and you were actually helping them make the transition from communist Eastern Europe to more of a capitalist system. But then you had all these property right issues, right? Like you could have been a Jew, got kicked out of your house, other people moved in, but then whose house is this? Are the original owners able to come back, or you lived in this house for 40 years? So is it now your house?
Yeah, no, this is one of the stories of ownership, is that it's that's one of the through lines of the book of mine, which is that ownership isn't natural. It isn't fixed. It's really a choice. And often it's a choice that's backed by power. So working in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union in the early 90s, I often worked with governments that were trying to figure out how to recreate a market economy after communism. I was part of the first team to not literally parachute in, but we'd be there within the first week after the revolutions would happen in each of these countries. And one of the first questions they always had for us was, for me, as I was in charge of a lot of the thinking about property rights and land and housing, was how do we reconnect to our pre-communist past, right? So there was a pre-communist past when there was private ownership, and then there was 50 years of communist ownership. And there was no way to simply cut out those 50 years. Like every house that formerly had been owned by a Jewish family in the Czech Republic or by a German family in the Czech Republic, where the German family had been kicked out after World War II, there was a Czech family that was living there for 50 years, and they had been put in that house. And they, after 50 years, people feel pretty attached. So it was a claim of right by the Czech family that had a very long attachment. Often kids and grandkids had grown up in the house. And then you had families that had been dispossessed, Jewish families or German families that had been kicked out after the war. And that was true in every Eastern European country where there were these conflicting claims, all of which had a lot of emotion behind them and a lot of intensity and a lot of validity to them. And again, it's not there isn't a correct answer to what you do about that. That problem of sequential dispossessions is the history of every country, right? That's the history of America with dispossession. It's history in Nicaragua today. It's the history in Cuba. It's history in China. That what you have as ownership, what seems so fixed, you have a piece of paper that's your deed to the land. If you trace that deed back, every single piece of paper, every deed in every country, it always traces back to some conquest or some dispossession. So in the Czech Republic, it was the communist dispossession. In America, it was dispossession of Native Americans, but that's true absolutely everywhere. It feels very natural to be an owner. But again, it's always a choice backed by power and time.
In a current event, I've been playing out, right now in the headlines, Trump has been talking about this law in South Africa and the question of, breaking up the white-owned farms. And so it's just, it's inescapable that there are always going to be sort of, I call them sort of conflicting temporal claims. I had it before, I should get it back. And how do you deal with that in a way that feels equitable?
In the book, we have a very simple equation, which is possession, I'm holding on to it, plus time equals ownership. Emotionally, that's just what it feels like. And it's very hard to sort of counter that powerful emotion of I'm holding on to it, and I've been holding on to it for a while, and that makes it mine. Like that's true for little kids in the playground. That's true for the judge in Colorado with the backyard. That's true for the solar panel owner who's trying to get the solar rays. Possession plus time is ownership. May not be right, may not be just, may not be moral, but it certainly is powerful.
Do you have like a particular story that just like sticks out in your mind from that particular time period? I mean, that's such a fascinating era.
Well, it was for me one of the most striking stories was working in Moscow right after. I guess I first went there when it was still the Soviet Union, where Gorbachev asked us to come in and say, if we were going to end the Soviet Union, what would be the first 100 steps that we do in each domain, in banking and ports, and my area was property rights, land and housing. And as part of that process, I spent a lot of time walking around with the deputy minister of housing, just walking around Moscow. We visited a bunch of towns. And one of the puzzles that for me most stood out was that the store, it was very cold. It was Moscow in the winter, so it was well below 0 degrees. And the storefronts were lit, and they were completely empty. So stores, it was right during the collapse of the Soviet Union. Stores were completely empty. But on the streets in front of the stores, there were these kiosks that had been plunked down that were just full of everything. If you wanted to buy a radio or bread or a bottle of wine, you went to a kiosk, but not to a store. And that for me was a really eye-opening puzzle. And what made me realize that was the moment when I discovered this gridlock principle, which is actually a different book from the one we're talking about today, about how too much ownership can lead to too little use. And in this case, the reason the stores were empty and lit is that they had multiple owners. There was the labor cooperative that owned the right to use the space. There was the company that owned the space itself. There was the town. There were 6 or 7 separate Soviet-style owners of every storefront, and they couldn't agree on who could use it. So the store sat empty. For the kiosks, you just paid off one criminal gang, and the gang would protect you, but just it was one gang, and it was a predictable amount of money. So it was easy to set up a kiosk on the street because it was a single owner, and it was impossible to use the stores, even though they were heated and they were lit and they were inside and they were completely empty because they had too many owners leading to too little ownership. They had gridlock ownership of storefronts in Moscow. So one of the first tasks for me as trying to think about how to create capitalism there was thinking about how to basically end that gridlock in storefront ownership.
Got anything to add, Jim? Or
I sometimes wonder about, we talk about it in the book, this question about what point do you lose a claim? So, it's one thing to say, my grandparents grew up in this apartment. They were, dispossessed or killed. We want it back. That I think is a very kind of, it's heartfelt, right? You can sort of sense the injustice there. But if it's, my family lived there 200 years ago or 500 years ago, then it seems less of a claim. And so, one example used in the book is, should a rock be able to claim Mesopotamian treasures in the Metropolitan Museum of Art? Right? How far back do these claims really sort of resonate? And again, it's storytelling.
one of the big themes of the book was that kind of laws, regulations, whatever, they kind of change as demographics change. Like as you kind of mentioned, like with the story of the redwood tree and the solar panels. Well, if each of these owners had 300 acres of property, well, maybe you don't have that issue. As you get denser cities, more technology, then you have to kind of revisit rules of ownership. And so, of course, now, your book, Mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives. This book was written a little bit before ChatGPT came out, and you had, intro 6 chapters plus epilogue. So I would imagine if you had an updated version, you probably would now have a whole chapter on AI. And then I was, as you mentioned, like in the book, like you get a book or you buy a book on Kindle, but in reality, you're kind of like maybe renting that book. Or same thing, you buy a movie, again, in air quotes, on, I don't know, say Amazon Prime or something. Do you really own that, as they can kind of take it away from you? But then this, of course, now goes to like EVs, where, you buy an EV, the EV has all the features built into it. So you have to pay to unlock it. Oh, I want heated seats because it's just moving it around in the software. Then when you sell that EV, they wipe out all those features that you bought, or who knows, maybe they can just unlock them at any time. Like, well, we actually we changed the heating seat element. Like, you're going to have to rebuy that feature again. So like, it's just a pretty, like, as we're going digital, like, who knows what ownership even means. So I think if you had an update, like, this chapter would be, it would be a whole book. It wouldn't even be a chapter, right, at this point.
Well, it's funny. I mean, yes and no, right? I mean, one of the things that's so much fun to just think about ownership and write about ownership is that in some respects nothing's changed since Babylonian times, right? The 6 stories that we teach in this book, if we'd been Babylonian professors, along the Euphrates and the Tigris, we would have given the same 6 stories. Their application's different, technologies are different. The example you're talking about, we're used to saying I own something. And if you pause for a sec, you literally mean something. More and more, that's actually not true. More and more, we own access to ones and zeros, which is a very different kind of thing. And one of the reasons that we oftentimes make mistakes in overestimating how much we actually do control is because we have the thing mentality in our head, when in fact it's not. We're moving basically to a renting economy of access to these ones and zeros. Michael?
Well, what that means is that there's an increasing gap today for all of us between what we feel like we own. What we feel like we own is the old thing version of ownership. It's a physical, tangible thing. There's an increasing gap between that, what we feel that we own, and what we actually own, which is, as Jim puts it, the stream of ones and zeros, where Amazon or Tesla gets to put things in and take things out from your cart, from your library, from your car. And because of that gap, because of your belief that you actually own the thing, and Tesla's or Amazon's knowledge that you don't, that means that those companies, as ownership engineers, which they are, they earn an extra premium, an unearned premium on every single transaction, because you feel like you own more than you own. And that feeling leads you to pay more than the actual value that you're getting from Tesla or Amazon, because they can take it away from you and under their terms of service. So the image that people have of this ownership story, possession is 9/10 of the law. That's one of our most powerful, primitive, territorial understandings of ownership. The notion of possession as 9/10 of the law is not true. In the world of Tesla or in the world of Amazon, possession is much more, or your cell phone, possession is much more like 1/10 of the law. Online businesses already know this. And you should too. Like, you should know that what you own in a world of ones and zeros is really different and much less from what you think that you own. So imagine, for example, that you're in a grocery store and you've gotten your full cart of, you've got your milk, you've got your eggs, it's all in your cart. And somebody just, as you're going to check out, someone just says, oh, look, you've collected all this useful stuff. And they reach into your shopping cart and take out the milk. And then say, oh yeah, eggs too, I want the eggs. You'd be totally shocked. But realize you don't own the stuff in your shopping cart. But if it feels, it's a thing, it feels like it's yours once you've put it in the cart. And what Amazon and Tesla are doing is they're coming into that shopping cart, or more concretely, they're coming into your car or your cell phone or your library, and they are taking features away, which they have the right to do, given the new form of ownership that we've created in this digital economy.
And on the flip side of that, is they're taking things that we probably should own but don't lay claim to, which is our information. Right? I mean, we're the product, not the other way around. And they sell this information, right, to advertisers. It's no surprise that, when I go on Orbitz or something to book a flight to Chicago, all of a sudden on my everything I do, there are ads coming up for Chicago restaurants, Chicago Play, Chicago this. They've sold that information instantaneously to other advertisers. That's me, right? That it's mine because it's part of me, and yet that's being sold. And so one of the big questions in the digital world is how much of our information about ourselves can we actually lay claim to as something that we own, rather than simply there to be taken.
We've mentioned ChatGPT. Let's say that you are a writer. So you either write a book, maybe you have a Substack, maybe you work for some major news publication, and you use chat to write this article or this piece. Or hell, even you're an academic and maybe you're writing a dissertation or something. I mean, is that plagiarism? Do you own it? I mean, right, yeah. I mean, be shocked if this happened, right? This is hypothetical, but who actually owns this piece of property?
You're asking the question as if there's an answer. And one of the messages of mine is that we have to choose the answer, right? That the answer is a choice. We have a very small number of possible stories that everyone uses to claim everything. We just talked about possession, or with the redwood trees, we talked about attachment, or the kid in the playground having it first. Those are 3 of the 6 simple stories. And there's no natural or correct answer. What you want to do is to be in control of the storytelling that then sets or naturalizes what the answer is that we come up with as a society. So this is something that I've struggled with. Among other things, I'm now, one of my hats is I'm the vice dean at the law school I teach at Columbia Law School. And we're trying right now, this month, to figure out what our policy is as a school for students and faculty using AI, and we're going to figure it out. We're going to look at what other schools do. We're going to think about what our students do, what's best pedagogically, but there's no correct answer to that. It's just a choice that we're going to make, and then we'll revisit it down the road. And that's true for us. That's true for you as a podcast owner. Like you're going to be using AI more and more in your research. We're going to be using it to prepare for these podcasts. And like whenever any new technology comes around, you have to make some initial choice about how the ownership is going to work. It was the same story 150 years ago when barbed wire was created. That was as revolutionary in the American West when they invented barbed wire in the 1860s as AI is today. Like our whole notion of ownership as no trespassing, keep out, like that was created when barbed wire was created. Before that, cattle just, your images of those great cattle drives, that was the pre-barbed wire version of ownership in America, where cattle just crossed over land. There was no stopping them. So in each generation, you have some new technology that seems to upend completely what it means to own something, but then you have to domesticate it the same way we domesticated the range, the cattle with barbed wire. We have to figure out some way to domesticate ownership today in a new world of AI. And there isn't a predetermined answer to that. What there is a battle, a series of battles that people will fight about what it should look like. I mean, I probably have my views, you probably have yours. And this is just how we design ownership always. It's always this ongoing discussion.
It's the point you made earlier, which is that the stories and the conflicts may change, but the underlying sort of choice doesn't change. There are 6 stories, and folks are going to use that to get what they want. And the fact is, we're going to have rules for AI, whether you take something from AI as theirs or as yours. We're going to have rules for how much AI can scrape, but what the rule is going to be is totally up for grabs right now. And the battles Michael is talking about are literally taking place right now, and they're taking place working through the courts, and they're taking place in legislatures. And there are very strong interests at play. And one of the key messages from mine for your listeners is that we can play a part in that discussion. Right? If you don't know something could be yours, you're not going to claim it. And the fact is, people care about, the creators care about whether stuff's being taken for AI. Folks are going to care about whether they can take things from AI and claim it as their own. And so this really is a free for all. This is not going to be a backroom deal. It's highly contested right now.
How do you think it's going to play out among countries? Because you're going to have different countries that are going to treat it differently. So maybe, like you kind of mentioned in the book, where Europe has a lot more, say, sensitivity to individual privacy. So being able to, say, utilize these technologies would be a lot more difficult. But then maybe that will prevent them from actually fully optimizing it. And then in, I don't know, 10 years from now, all of a sudden you're going to have kind of these winners and losers and these inequalities among different countries based on how they actually treat it. Because to me, I think it's a pretty big deal if some countries have access to this and other countries don't because of their privacy rights.
One of the cool things about ownership in America, just to take it back one step, is that we have 50 different states, and ownership law in this country is state law. There isn't really a federal law of property. It's all state by state. So Puerto Rico has its law, and New York has its law, and Colorado, California, each have our own laws. And so it sort of makes a natural experiment. And similarly, the U.S. has a zone of laws that's somewhat different from what the Europeans have. The Europeans have much more privacy protecting than America is. But that forms a natural experiment. You can see, like you said, in 10 years or 20 years or 5 years, which economy is performing better and along what dimensions, but then you then have you've solved the problem of the imagination, which is that it's very, very hard to come up with different alternatives if you don't see them somewhere else in the world. So, but if you do see, hey, look, I'd rather live a little bit poorer, but a lot more protected in terms of privacy with the European model, or a little more of a free-for-all, and I'll give it all, and the ads that track me are eerily prescient in America. You can then make choices about, as a society, which direction you want to push laws push it more in a European direction on privacy or more in an American direction in a free-for-all. But having the sort of natural laboratory of different jurisdictions trying different things is actually kind of cool. It's not a bug. It's really a feature of ownership to have lots of different versions that people are trying out in different parts of the world. And then you can look around and say, hey, that's really cool. Like, for example, condominium law didn't used to be part of American law. Like when in 1960, there were no condominiums in America. If you wanted to build a building up and have different owners, it was very hard to do. The only place that did that was New York City, that has these old, very hard to manage co-ops. Anyway, so New York regulators said, hey, there's this weird German form of ownership called the condominium. They didn't see it in Germany. They went on vacation to Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico had imported German condominium law. And New York lawyers said, hey, this is really cool. This is a nice experiment someone did somewhere else, and it made it possible for people to own separate units in a taller building. And they brought it to New York. And now, once New York had it, then every state in America has it. And now today, 9 out of 10 new homes in America are built in some form of condominium or residential association. So having variety, having this sort of laboratory of different jurisdictions making ownership turns out to be really cool way to come up with like better ways to do things.
But there's a dark side as well. And that is that some states may actually shape their rules of ownership in order to attract certain types of investments or businesses that actually don't work out so well for people. And so South Dakota, it turns out that if you want to create an aristocracy where the assets you leave for your kids are essentially not going to be taxed, you set up a trust in South Dakota. Right. Or, the fact that there's so many credit cards in South Dakota also, so it's somewhat of an allied story as well. And so what Michael's saying is absolutely right. You have a laboratory for experiments, but the experiments don't always don't always improve social welfare. Sometimes they improve the interests of very well-moneyed, concentrated interests. It goes both ways.
Yeah. So America's super rich have built this completely parallel ownership system in South Dakota that almost nobody knows about. Like I sort of knew about South Dakota because of Mount Rushmore, or maybe you know about it because of the Sturgis motorcycle rally. But if you're super rich, like that's not why you know South Dakota. You know because they have this parallel legal system that has crushed Switzerland. It is crushing the Cayman Islands as a place for super rich people to basically place their money. So South Dakota says to New Yorkers and Californians, to basically where rich people actually want to live, you can live in New York, you can live in California, but your money, if it lives in South Dakota, is going to basically escape all sorts of taxes that everyone else in New York and California pays to actually provide the schools and fix the roads and so on. So the downside, the dark side, as Jim says, of the sort of variety of ownership in America is that state ownership allows the most deviant states, like South Dakota, to basically impoverish everybody else.
Yeah, it's interesting because in Puerto Rico, like if you're a resident of Puerto Rico, you don't actually pay federal taxes. And then, but there's also no taxation without representation. So if you live in Puerto Rico, you are a U.S. citizen, but you're not actually able to vote for the U.S. president because you don't pay federal taxes. But then there's a lot of people that move from the mainland over to Puerto Rico, which they have an act called Act 60, and it's the same thing in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which exempts you from paying local taxes. But then there's a lot of people that don't like Puerto Rico. They move here to not pay taxes, federal or local, and I'll be talking to some of my friends and they move back. I was like, I thought you moved here for the tax reasons. They're like, oh, trust me, you just gotta basically like get a trust in South Dakota. It's the exact same, and you can live in California or Florida or wherever. Yeah.
For your listeners, these to avoid a lot of these taxes, it's really meant for people who are richer than you are. It's really meant for people who are in the 50 ordinary people, the rest of us, we all pay it's very hard not to pay your taxes. You go to jail. But if you're super rich, you have this parallel legal system. But it's really meant for people who are in the 50 million or above household net worth range. They're the ones who actually can afford the lawyers and trusts and so on that it takes to set up these complicated South Dakota South Dakota trusts. It's terrible for the American economy. It's terrible for, no road gets paved in South Dakota. They have terrible educational system, but it benefits a very small number of South Dakota trust lawyers who basically write the laws there. So, maybe South Dakota is not the only place. So Puerto Rico has some advantages as well. I grew up in Washington, D.C., which was the exact opposite. It was taxation. We paid full taxes, but we had no representation. So maybe Washington, D.C. here should all move to Puerto Rico.
Right. And if you're driving around D.C., all you have to do is look at the license plate to realize the angst of the locals with that as well. Like, it's pretty obvious.
High school friend of mine actually coined that. The license plates in D.C. say taxation without representation. There was a guy named Jamie Raskin, who's now a congressman from Maryland. He was one of his, great brainstorms.
And then just kind of on a side note before we wrap this up, but how long did you actually work at the World Bank for?
That was it was for 4 or 5 years. It was just an interlude between after law school before going into law teaching. It was really super interesting time. It was right when the Berlin Wall had fallen, right when these countries were trying to create capitalism. And it turns out creating capitalism is hard to do. And it was really interesting to do for a couple of years. I loved that. I loved the work. I loved people I worked with. Loved the counterparts in the countries I worked in. But when it became possible to go into law teaching, it turns out law teaching is an even better job. So I always tell my students, it's better than working for a living.
And have you been back to some of the places that you went to in the 90s when you were making this transition? What do you has it been successful? I mean, you're talking early 90s
complicated. Yeah. It's, Russia was very challenging, and I would say has not been as successful overall, of course. And some of these countries did very well initially, like Hungary, and then has had a lot of backsliding since. It depends a little bit on what area of the economy that you're concerned about. So if you're concerned about industrial privatization and wealth equality, a lot of these countries have not done very well. But the area that I specifically worked on, which was housing privatization, actually did pretty well. We took 100 million housing units, apartments in Russia, and turned them and made the people who lived there owners. It was the first big thing that most Soviets, then Russians, ever owned in their lives, and that actually was overall, I think, reasonably successful to jumpstart sort of private markets, private initiative in what you call your home, which is really very fundamental to people.
Today's guest has been Michael Heller and James Salzman, the authors of the book Mine: How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives. So just a final question that both of you can answer. We'll start with you, Michael, which is just if you can share where people can find you, any kind of stuff that you're working on, and then leave us with a final thought. So for both of you.
Well, the first place I would go is to our website, which is minethebook.com. So it's all one word, minethebook.com. And on there, we have videos from some of the cooler stories, like why is New York City drinking water the best cleanest, tastiest drinking water in the world, and it's not treated? Or how does the buy now button on Amazon actually give you less than you think? All those stories, we have short videos. We have excerpts from the book. We have reviews. So it's a good resource. If you're interested in these kinds of issues, go to minethebook.com. The next project, Jim and I together are working on a new book called, well, we don't know the title yet, but about mine for deals, for exchange, for basically how we get what we want. So mine is about who gets what, and the next book is about how we get what we want. So that's our next project. Look for it in airport bookstores in a couple of years.
Michael, what's your final thought related to this podcast?
So one last thought is that the rules that shape your life every day, every minute are not that hard, not that complicated. There's just these 6 simple stories, like first and like possession. And once you see how ownership really does work today in the 21st century, my hope for you is that it makes you a more effective advocate for change for yourself as a consumer, but also as a citizen.
Yeah, and I just amplify that. I mean, we're both teachers, we're both educators, and the kind of the best moments we both have is when students suddenly just get it. And by get it, I mean they look at the world differently. The world looks different. And looking at the world through the vantage of ownership, it looks different. A lot of things suddenly click into focus and make sense. You know, we talked about that silly example of camp out for Duke basketball, but there are thousands of examples like that. And, you know, when you see something that just doesn't make a lot of sense or seems odd, ask yourself, who owns what? What are they trying to get people to do? And does thinking about this through your ownership glasses suddenly click into place? As Michael said, our book is full of those things. It explains why Disney World's lines look the way they do. It talks about saving seats, you know, at a show, putting down blankets at a concert. How do these things work out? And it really is, I mean, ownership is the scaffolding. It's the framework for how we live our lives, so we don't basically kill each other too often trying to get the stuff we all want. And so I just think, you know, it's if you're looking for a book that is going to make for great dinner table conversation, this is it.
Yeah, and I also like the extending the beaches. If the city's bringing in sand, I mean, who owns the beach? I mean, it just, there's so many fascinating stories. No, thank you guys so much for spending time with us talking about your book, Mine, today.
Thanks so much.
Totally a pleasure, Jesse. Anytime.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.